I was on a call with a client a couple of years ago, and we were talking about retirement spending, and I was going through my usual talking points. And the client interrupted me, and he's like, "It's not that I don't trust you, but do you have any data to back up what you're saying?" Well, they were in luck because one of our values as a firm is that we're evidence-based and data-driven. And so we had the numbers to back up what we were saying. Well, if you were one of those analytical, data-driven people and you care about retirement planning, you're in luck because JP Morgan did a giant study on retirement spending. Actually, they did two studies on it. And it's probably the best study on this topic because they were able to pull from a wealth of data from their banking clients and their credit card clients. They anonymized the data and then gave us a deep dive into spending in retirement. And like I said, they did two studies. The first was in 2019 with over 5 million households. And then they updated the study recently with an additional 280,000 households. And the study found three key pieces of information that I want to explore today. The first is the spending curve, the retirement spending surge, and spending volatility. But first, my name is Kevin Lum. I'm a certified financial planner, and this channel is dedicated to helping 1 million people retire without worry. So let's start with the basics of spending. There's a lot of misunderstanding around spending, especially in retirement. Now, typically, the rule of thumb is that the average person will spend somewhere between 70 to 80% of their pre-retirement spending level in retirement. And that is basically true, but it's simplistic and it causes a bit of confusion because some people say, well, I'm going to be eating out more because I'm going to have more time on my hands. I'm going to be traveling more. How does my spending fall? In reality, spending peaks between your late 40s and early 50s. And this makes sense. You're paying off your house still. You might have kids in school. They're either in college or might be starting college just around the corner. And so for a number of reasons, it's the most expensive stage in life. But often, in addition to your increasing life expenses, you're also earning more and you're giving yourself freedom to spend. I still remember the first time my wife dropped the phrase heirloom quality. Actually, what she said was, it's expensive, but it's heirloom quality. And I was like, what is heirloom quality? And she said, at some point in life, people start shopping somewhere other than IKEA. They buy things that they could pass down to the next generation. Luckily for me, my wife buys most of our heirloom quality items on Craigslist. But the idea is between your late 40s and your early 50s, spending peaks. And then it begins to fall. Spending goes down, but you don't feel like you're spending less because now you're in the catch-up phase of life. Around 50, you realize, oh crap, I should get serious about saving for retirement. So as your spending begins to decline, your savings really begins to accelerate as you get closer to retirement. And then once you retire, in theory, you should stop saving. And that opens up a massive amount of cash flow in your budget. And for many people, at the same time that they stop saving, their mortgage is paid off, the kids are out of college, and so spending begins to drop. And so around the time that many of us retire, a couple of things happen. Our home is almost paid off often. If we had kids, the kids are out of college or nearly out of college and kind of on their own. And now we're not saving for retirement. And this opens up a massive amount of cash flow in your budget. And so even though you may be spending more money when you first retire, right? Often when people first retire, they spend more money on going out to eat because now they've got more time in their hands. They spend more money on travel. But in general, in retirement, people's spending decreases. And this is exactly what the study from JP Morgan shows us. But as we age, spending begins to decline and it declines all the way through the end of retirement. And so that is the basic of spending. It peaks in your late 40s to early 50s. And even though we're taking more trips and maybe eating out more when we retire, ultimately our overall spending begins to decrease. But there are a couple of interesting things that jumped out at me in the study from JP Morgan. The first was the spending surge. 53% of households don't retire all at once. They're partially retired. And what was really interesting to me is that these households, the partially retired households, they see a surge in spending. And so you can see it here in this chart. There are two lines in the chart. The top line is the partially retired households, which is 53% of American households. The bottom line is people who just retire cold turkey. And what we see is that on the partially retired households, there is a surge in spending. But what really surprised me is not only do they spend more, but they have more credit card debt than before retirement. So we see not only an increase in spending, but we also see an increase in credit card debt. And the spending surge, according to studies, shows up in three areas. People are spending more money on healthcare, on food, and on apparel. But here's the kicker. This only happens in households earning less than 150,000 a year. Higher income households don't see the same spending surge. Now, the study doesn't get into why we see the spending surge, but my guess is that as people get near retirement, they're partially retired and they start getting some of that retirement income, they begin to feel a bit richer and they give themselves permission to spend. It reminds me of a video I did a while back where I actually encourage people to take care of healthcare expenses and make some of the big purchases before they retire. But like I said, what surprised me was not only is there a spike in spending, but there's also a spike in credit card debt. And that makes me wonder if spending doesn't get out of control, right? You haven't spent much money, you haven't given yourself permission to spend. And then all of a sudden, once you begin spending, it's hard to stop spending. So if you earn under $150,000 a year, the data suggests you'll likely see a surge in spending if you partially retire. Like I said, you do not see this in households who earn over $150,000 a year, and you don't see this in fully retired households. And my guess is that the fully retired households are just a bit more nervous to spend. They're afraid to spend. And so we don't see the same jump in spending. So the first thing is often when you retire, you may see a surge in spending before it begins to decline. The second thing the study showed was what they called spending volatility. Spending in retirement is often volatile. The data shows that 60% of households will experience spending volatility in the first few years of retirement. Now, that lessens over time, but it never disappears, meaning retirement spending is going to be bumpy. Some years you'll spend 20% more. Some years you'll spend 20% less. And I see this all the time with clients. It's not a big problem as long as the averages work out and you manage the risk, but it does increase risk. The study says volatile spending creates short-term liquidity needs and can worsen long-term funding risks. It continues on to say, at the beginning of retirement, volatility can heighten the sequence of return risk. This, by the way, is why we spend a lot of time planning around liquidity for clients, because you want to make sure that you have the money they need to spend when they need to spend it without risking selling into a downturn. Because often when you first retire, spending can be a bit volatile and it's a bit hard to predict because you're new to retiring. And so you might think you're going to spend $100,000 a year. If you plan for $100,000 a year and then you spend $120,000 or $150,000, it can mess up your income plan. So you want to be careful as you're putting together your income plan that you plan for a bit of volatility during the early years of retirement. So the first thing you want to watch out for is a spike in spending when you first retire. The second thing you want to pay attention to is that your spending may be volatile during your first few years of retirement. The third thing the study discovered is called the spending curve, which is also what I often refer to as the spending smile. I've talked about this before in other videos, but the spending smile, it basically is this. You'll spend more early in retirement, and then as you begin to age, your spending begins to decline, and then it may spike again at the end of your retirement because of healthcare costs, right? So it ends up creating a smile. You tend to spend more money early in retirement, and then it's going to decrease, and sometimes it'll spike at the end of retirement. And so one of the major mistakes that people make when planning for retirement spending, they plan for 3 to 4% inflation per year in retirement, right? So if they need $100,000 a year, then you get 103 and, so forth and so on. And it's just kind of the steady climb up. But that's not the actual rate of inflation for most retirees because of the spending smile. The actual number, when you take into account the spending smile, is closer to 1.8%. So between the ages of 45 to 49, spending peaks and then it gradually declines. And eventually you will spend less on 9 out of 10 categories. Eventually, you're going to spend less on everything except healthcare. Healthcare inflation is brutal. According to the study by JP Morgan, you should plan on 6% healthcare inflation per year, meaning that an individual should plan on $6,860 per person per year on Medicare. Each couple should plan on $13,720 per year. In 10 years, that 13,700 is going to be 24,500, which is a massive increase in just 10 years of time. And on top of the healthcare costs, we also have the long-term care bombshell. 75% of women and 65% of men are going to need some type of long-term care during the retirement, and that number is not included in the healthcare costs, right? So you need to be sure that when you're building out your retirement plan, that you're accounting for healthcare that's going to increase much faster than the typical rate of inflation, and that you're accounting for long-term care costs, which are also increasing faster than the rate of inflation. If you've used the software Right Capital that we've given everyone access to, one of the things you may have noticed is that we split out long-term care cost and healthcare cost from all the other expenses. And the reason we do that is so we can inflate them at a different rate of inflation. So a lot of plans will just inflate everything at 3 to 4%. And what it ends up doing is making the plan look less successful or causing your expenses to look overly large in some areas and not fully to account for inflation in other areas. But this is why you need really careful planning when it comes to retirement income and retirement spending. And you need to make sure that you're properly accounting for how people actually spend in retirement. But overall, what you see is that for most people, their annual rate of inflation is at 3 to 4%. It's 1.8% on everything except healthcare. And so overall, your spending is going to come down as you begin to age. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. If you want to look at the study, I'll put a QR code up here, or you can click a link in the bio and I'll send the study over to you so you can look at it. But the three big things that I think are really interesting that you'll see in the study is the retirement spending surge, that for a lot of people, you need to be prepared for a surge in spending as you enter retirement. And then also be prepared for spending volatility. Make sure you're taking that into account as you're creating your spending plan. And then also think about the spending smile and what the actual rate of inflation will be when you're putting together your plan. But ultimately, one of the really interesting things that came out of the study is that your biggest risk, with the exception of healthcare, isn't inflation. It's a sequence of return risk, also known as the income death spiral. And if you've never heard of the income death spiral, you're in luck. I have a whole video on this topic that you can watch here.